For the medieval peasant, surviving year-round wasn't just about enduring the elements, it was about ensuring there was always enough to eat. In a world where the seasons dictated your life and your work, keeping food on the table was as much a battle of ingenuity as it was a matter of survival. Without refrigeration, supermarkets, or convenience stores, peasants had to rely on their knowledge of nature and resourcefulness to stay fed through the toughest months. Whether it was preserving food during the abundant harvests of summer or making sure there was enough for the winter months when fresh produce was scarce, the methods they used were nothing short of brilliant. They didn't just survive, they thrived. The key to a peasant's ability to stay fed all year long was rooted in their ability to preserve. The act of preservation was more than just a seasonal task, it was a way of life. Peasants didn't rely solely on what they could eat in the moment. They knew they had to plan ahead, to store away enough to get through long stretches of lean times. One of the most ingenious methods they developed was salting. While today we might think of salt as nothing more than a condiment, for medieval peasants, it was a precious preservative, a tool that allowed them to keep meat, fish, and even vegetables edible long after they were harvested. Salt had a special place in medieval kitchens. It was used not just for flavor, but as a natural preservative that prevented spoilage and decay. After the summer months, when fresh food began to spoil and the frost had yet to arrive, peasants would salt large amounts of fish, pork, and beef, ensuring that they had enough protein to last them through the colder months. Salted meats could be stored in cool, dry places, and while they weren't as appetizing as fresh cuts, they were the difference between hunger and survival. The salting process was simple but effective. Peasants would pack their meats in large barrels or wooden crates, covering them completely with salt to draw out moisture, a key factor in preventing bacteria from growing. The salted food was also often smoked, adding an additional layer of preservation. The smoke itself helped keep pests away, while the added flavor made the otherwise tough and dry salted meat more palatable. This smoking method, combined with the salting, created a system of food preservation that could last for months. But the question remained, how did peasants ensure they had enough salt, especially when it wasn't easily accessible? Salt was a valuable commodity, and in many areas it was traded or even taxed. It wasn't just the rich who needed salt, it was the peasants, the working class, who relied on it most for survival. So how did they secure enough to get through the year? This is where their resourcefulness came into play. Salt was often harvested from local salt pans, shallow pools where seawater evaporated in the sun. But even if salt wasn't readily available, peasants had other clever ways of ensuring they wouldn't run out. Some villages even had their own salt production methods, turning to alternative sources like salt springs or digging their own salt mines. Yet, salting meat was just one part of the puzzle. What about vegetables, grains, and fruits, which were far more susceptible to spoilage? During the growing season, peasants were relentless in their pursuit of harvests, ensuring that every bit of produce was used to its fullest potential. When vegetables like carrots, turnips, onions, and cabbage were in season, peasants would take advantage of the abundance, drying or pickling them to preserve their nutrition for the colder months. This process was done through simple but effective methods, drying by hanging vegetables in the sun or smoking them over the fire. These dried vegetables would become key ingredients in soups, stews, and porridges during the winter, ensuring that no nutritional value went to waste. Pickling, too, was a technique that allowed peasants to keep their food edible long past its prime. Using vinegar, salt, and sometimes sugar, peasants would pickle everything from cucumbers to eggs, creating jars of preserved food that would last months. The pickling process itself was an art, carefully choosing the right combination of spices and herbs to make the vegetables not only edible but delicious. These preserved vegetables provided peasants with essential vitamins, especially when the fresh produce was no longer available. But pickling wasn't the only way peasants preserved their harvests. The drying of grains was another crucial part of their strategy for ensuring they had enough food throughout the year. Grains like barley, oats, and wheat were at the heart of the peasant diet, providing the carbs and energy needed to perform the grueling farm labor required of them. But these grains had to be harvested at just the right time, before the first frost when they were at their peak. Once harvested, peasants would grind the grains into flour, and they had several methods for storing it to prevent it from spoiling. In many cases, they stored their grain in cool, dry places, often in underground cellars that maintained a stable, cold temperature. These cellars, often dug into hillsides or beneath the home, acted as natural refrigeration, keeping grains fresh for months on end. In other areas, peasants built grain silos, tall cylindrical structures designed to protect grain from moisture and pests, particularly rodents. These silos were often elevated, keeping the precious grain off the ground and away from the dangers of dampness or insects. But despite their best efforts to preserve food, there were always risks. The unpredictable nature of the weather, the fickle harvests, and the constant threat of disease could leave peasants vulnerable, even with their clever preservation techniques. So, what did they do when their reserves ran low or when the harvest didn't turn out as expected? One of the most ingenious ways peasants ensured their survival during the leanest months was by using root cellars. These underground storage areas, built into the earth and often located beneath the family home, provided an environment that was naturally cool and humid, perfect for storing root vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and beets. The root cellar was an incredibly effective method of food preservation because the natural temperature and humidity kept the vegetables from rotting or freezing. Peasants would harvest their root crops before the first frost and then store them in these cool, dark spaces to ensure they had access to fresh vegetables all winter long. But root cellars weren't foolproof. There was always the threat of rot or disease creeping in, threatening the entire crop. So how did they ensure their root cellars stayed effective year after year? That's where proper ventilation and the practice of checking the food came into play. Peasants knew that, in order for their cellars to work, they had to regulate the airflow and keep the storage conditions just right. The need for proper ventilation in these root cellars was crucial. If the cellar became too damp, it could lead to mold, mildew, and rotting produce. To avoid this, peasants would dig ventilation shafts or create small openings at the top of the cellar, allowing fresh air to circulate and maintain a stable, cool temperature. These simple but effective methods helped keep the food fresh for as long as possible, especially during the winter months when fresh produce was scarce. But even with all the clever storage methods in place, the real question remained: how did peasants ensure that there was enough food to last when nature wasn't cooperating? How did they prevent famine from taking hold when the harvest failed or when the weather turned too harsh? As we move deeper into the life of a medieval peasant, we'll uncover more of their strategies for hunting, foraging, and bartering, methods that helped them ensure they had enough to eat when the odds were stacked against them. But what about the most vulnerable periods in a peasant's life? The long winters when fresh food was hard to come by? How did they navigate these harsh conditions? The answers may surprise you. The long, cold winters that descended upon medieval peasants were often a time of desperation. When the last of the harvest had been stored away and the salted meats were beginning to lose their appeal, survival became a matter of maintaining hope as much as it was about keeping hunger at bay. Despite their ingenuity, food preservation techniques, and well-planned cellars, there were always lean times when resources began to dwindle. But even in these dire circumstances, peasants had developed several methods to sustain themselves, and their ability to adapt was unparalleled. One of the most crucial survival strategies in the winter was hunting. While peasants were largely dependent on the food they could grow or preserve, they also understood the importance of hunting for fresh meat. Though hunting was often restricted by local lords, who claimed hunting rights over vast swaths of land, peasants still managed to hunt smaller game like rabbits, squirrels, and birds. These animals were not only a source of fresh food, but also provided skins and pelts that could be traded or used for clothing. During the winter, peasants would often set traps or snares, utilizing their knowledge of local animal behavior to catch game. The skill of trapping was passed down through generations, and many peasants became incredibly adept at setting traps for the elusive creatures that roamed the forests, fields, and rivers. In addition to smaller game, peasants also took advantage of the scavenger food chain. It was not uncommon for them to hunt or scavenge carcasses left behind by larger predators, such as wolves or wild dogs. These carcasses were sometimes too damaged to sell or trade, but could still be used for meat. In a society where every scrap of food counted, nothing was wasted. The bones from these animals could be boiled into broth, providing both nutrition and warmth, and the fat rendered from these animals was valuable for cooking or as a source of oil for lamps. But while hunting was an essential winter strategy, it was not always reliable. The more predictable source of nutrition came from foraging, which relied on an acute knowledge of the land. In the winter, food did not simply stop growing, it slowed down, and many plants adapted to the cold, offering up their bounty in smaller but no less essential amounts. Many peasants knew the locations of wild edibles that could be found even in the dead of winter. Wintergreen, sorrel, and nettles were just a few examples of the wild herbs and greens that could be harvested during the cold months. These plants were not only a valuable source of vitamins and minerals, but were also often used for medicinal purposes, helping to stave off illnesses like scurvy, which could be deadly if not addressed. However, the most reliable and ingenious way peasants ensured they would always have food, even in the darkest months of winter, was by preserving their harvests through fermentation. While pickling was a popular method of preserving vegetables, fermentation created a different kind of food storage technique that could add nutritional value as well as flavor. Fermented foods like sauerkraut, kimchi, and fermented dairy were staples in the medieval peasant diet. These fermented foods, which were often stored in large clay pots or wooden barrels, helped preserve the food while also introducing beneficial bacteria that promoted digestion and health. The lacto-fermentation process used to preserve cabbage, for example, created a highly nutritious food that could be eaten throughout the winter months. Sauerkraut was particularly important for its ability to provide much-needed vitamin C, helping to prevent scurvy and boost the immune system during the harsh winter. Fermented dairy products also played an important role in the medieval diet. Cheese was a common preservation technique, as it could be made from the milk of cows, goats, or sheep and stored for months at a time. Cheese could be stored in cool, dry places, and even the poorest peasants could create cheese from their animals' milk. Different types of cheese could be made, some soft, some hard, and all packed with nutrients. The process of cheese making also provided another important byproduct, whey, which was used in soups, stews, or as a protein supplement. But not all methods of preserving food were so simple. For example, canning might seem like a modern technique, but medieval peasants had their own version of sealing food in jars for long-term storage. They didn't have glass jars or the technology we use today, but they had ceramic or earthenware pots, which they used to store meat, fish, or vegetables. By sealing the jars with beeswax or animal fat, peasants could create airtight containers that preserved food for extended periods. Though this method was not as widespread as salting or pickling, it proved to be an effective way to keep food fresh for longer periods, especially in areas where salt was scarce or expensive. Yet even with the use of these preservation methods, there were always risks involved. Peasants had to contend with the natural elements, the unpredictability of the weather, and the threat of disease. It was often said that the year's crops are only as good as the harvest. And the truth was sometimes harvests failed. A bad season could leave a village hungry, especially if the preservation methods had not been followed properly. Peasants also understood that if food was stored improperly or too long, it could go bad, and they would risk losing their reserves. But what happened when those reserves did run low, and it became too dangerous to leave the house to forage or hunt? What happened when the cold and isolation made survival a true struggle? One of the final strategies peasants had to rely on in times of dire need was the community system. In many medieval villages, food shortages were not only handled individually, but the community would come together to ensure that no one starved. In times of crisis, peasants might pool their resources, sharing food with those who had run low on supplies. The community feast was one such tradition. When the harvest was bountiful, villagers would hold a feast, sharing what they had with the less fortunate. These feasts were not just about food. They were about reinforcing the communal ties that kept villages strong through the tough times. This practice helped mitigate food insecurity when individual families were unable to feed themselves. This spirit of cooperation extended beyond food sharing. It also encompassed bartering. When one family had an excess of dairy or grains, they might trade with another family that had an abundance of meat or vegetables. Bartering allowed peasants to obtain what they lacked and keep food circulating through the community. It wasn't always a perfect system, but it worked. Fairs and market days were central to this exchange. These were times when farmers and peasants from surrounding villages would come together to trade food, tools, and other goods. While these markets were seasonal and often a risk in bad weather, they allowed peasants to access items they might not have been able to produce themselves. But despite all these ingenious strategies, one of the most critical aspects of survival came down to the ability of medieval peasants to adapt. Each season presented new challenges. Crops might be affected by pests or storms, the price of salt could rise, or food shortages could be exacerbated by a long, hard winter. But one thing remained constant. the peasants' ability to make do with what they had. Their resourcefulness was their most valuable tool, and it allowed them to improvise when things didn't go as planned. Peasants also relied on their knowledge of wild food sources, a deep, intimate understanding of the land that was passed down through generations. From acorns to mushrooms, wild berries to tree sap, medieval peasants knew how to make the most of what nature provided, even in the dead of winter. But the more one learns about how these survival techniques worked, the more one realizes that there was more to medieval life than just surviving the cold months. What the peasants faced was a constant balancing act between nature and necessity, and how they overcame these challenges helped shape the legacy of the medieval world. However, what about the role of the medieval farm animals in ensuring a steady supply of food? What about the clever methods peasants used to make sure their animals could weather the winter and continue to provide fresh food? As we uncover more of their techniques, the story continues to unfold, revealing deeper layers of this resourceful, resilient culture. As winter dragged on and the biting cold seeped into every crevice of medieval life, the ingenuity of peasants continued to shine through in the ways they maintained their food supplies. Though hunting, foraging, and preserving had already secured their basic needs, it was the presence of farm animals that provided a constant and reliable source of nutrition, warmth, and even income. Whether they were raising chickens for eggs, cows for milk, or pigs for meat, animals played an indispensable role in the lives of medieval peasants. But how did they ensure that these animals could survive the harsh conditions of winter and continue to provide the sustenance their families depended on? In medieval villages, farm animals were far more than just sources of food. They were integral to the economy and survival. Cows, goats, sheep, and pigs were essential for milk, meat, leather, and wool. Chickens provided eggs and meat, while ducks and geese were kept for both eggs and feathers. But ensuring the survival of these animals during the winter was no small feat. Just like the peasants themselves, farm animals had to be carefully managed, especially when food supplies were low and the weather grew harsh. The first challenge for peasants was ensuring adequate shelter for their animals. Barns and stables were constructed with thick walls, often made of wood or stone, to protect animals from the cold. These structures were often located close to the home, and it wasn't uncommon for animals to share space with the family during the most brutal months of winter. The idea of having cows, pigs, and chickens all in one room may seem uncomfortable, but in the medieval world, this arrangement was beneficial for both humans and animals. The body heat generated by livestock helped to keep the barn warmer, reducing the burden on the family's own heating sources. This communal warmth also made it easier for peasants to care for their animals, as they didn't have to venture out into the freezing cold every time they needed to tend to their herds. Feeding the animals was another critical aspect of maintaining a steady food supply. During the winter months, fresh pasture was scarce, so peasants had to store feed in the fall to see the animals through the cold months. Hay, straw, and oats were often cut and stored in barns, along with root vegetables such as turnips and beets, which were high in nutrition and perfect for feeding livestock. In the harshest winters, peasants even turned to cutting branches from trees to create browse, young tree shoots, especially for sheep and goats. These branches provided vital nutrition when other sources were limited. While these measures might seem basic, they were often the difference between the survival or death of a farm animal during the winter months. But it wasn't just about providing food for the animals. It was about protecting them from illness. Just as the peasants themselves faced the threat of sickness during winter, their livestock were vulnerable to cold-related diseases, especially pneumonia and respiratory infections. Farmers and peasants had learned over time that keeping the barns and stables dry and well ventilated was essential. Excess moisture could cause mold, mildew, and bacteria to flourish, which could lead to severe health issues in animals. Ensuring that the bedding was clean and dry, and that the barn wasn't overcrowded, was just as important for the animals as it was for the humans who lived nearby. While it may seem that farm animals were primarily kept for their direct food benefits, they were also a valuable source of manure, a crucial component in sustaining crops. This waste was carefully collected, often stored in manure pits, and then spread across the fields in the spring to fertilize the soil. Without this natural fertilizer, the productivity of medieval farms would have been severely limited. Animal manure helped peasants grow grain crops, which were essential for their food supply. But the value of animal manure didn't stop at the fields. It also played a role in food preservation. In a world without refrigeration, keeping food cold was often a struggle. Peasants, however, had figured out an innovative way to keep things cool by storing their perishable food in ice houses. These were small, insulated buildings, often dug into the ground and lined with straw, where ice could be stored through the winter. The ice was collected from frozen lakes or rivers and placed in these ice houses, where it could last well into the warmer months. The ice provided a cool, dry environment that was perfect for storing meat, dairy, and other perishables. In some cases, animal manure was used to pack the ice, helping it stay frozen longer. It's amazing how the most basic resources could be combined to create a system that made life just a little bit easier. But while the animals provided much-needed food, warmth, and fertilizer, peasants had another tool that helped them get through the winter: the barter system. Trading was a fundamental part of medieval life, especially for peasants who often didn't have access to the same wealth as the aristocracy. A neighbor who had a surplus of eggs might trade them for grain, while someone who raised pigs might trade meat or lard for wool or other goods. Trading allowed peasants to secure foods and resources that they couldn't produce themselves, and it helped create a network of support within rural communities. Villages were often interconnected by informal trade routes, where goods were exchanged between families, often without the involvement of money. Even in the depths of winter, when food was in short supply and the weather made travel difficult, the barter system ensured that people were able to feed their families. It wasn't just about providing for one's own household, it was about supporting the entire community, especially in times of need. Bartering had an inherent reciprocity that kept communities together, and it helped people survive when their reserves were nearly depleted. In addition to these methods, community gardens played an important role in ensuring that everyone had enough to eat. These communal plots, often cultivated by several families together, allowed peasants to grow vegetables in a shared space. Crops like cabbages, onions, and potatoes could be grown in these gardens, providing fresh produce during the summer and fall months. In the winter, communal gardens weren't as productive, but they still offered a space for growing winter greens, such as kale and spinach, that could survive in colder temperatures. The role of the feast in medieval life cannot be overstated. Feasts were held at various points throughout the year, often during times of harvest or to mark important religious events. While these feasts were often a time for celebrating, they also served a practical purpose: community, solidarity. The local lord or wealthier landowners would provide food and drink for all, ensuring that everyone had enough to eat, regardless of their personal circumstances. These feasts were not just about indulgence. They were a crucial safety net for many peasants, offering a reprieve from the strains of a difficult season. But even with the most creative preservation methods and resourceful farming techniques, famine was still a very real threat. Medieval peasants were always at the mercy of the weather, and a bad harvest could wipe out their stores for the year. The reality was that, despite all the clever tricks and survival strategies, survival wasn't guaranteed. Disease, war, or poor harvests could leave entire villages starving. But through it all, peasants adapted, never allowing themselves to give in to despair. So while the medieval peasant world may seem far removed from our own, it is clear that the strategies they developed to ensure they could stay fed were not only ingenious, they were crucial to their survival. They adapted to their environment in a way that allowed them to make the most of every resource, from animals and grains to the very earth beneath their feet. Their survival wasn't simply about subsistence, it was about resilience, creativity, and a fierce commitment to their families and communities. Today, as we face our own challenges, we can look back at the resourcefulness of these peasants and be reminded of the incredible human capacity for adaptation in the face of hardship. But what happens when we look beyond food, beyond animals, and into the very soil that sustained their lives? How did peasants continue to grow crops year after year with the land under constant strain? The answer lies in a deeper understanding of medieval farming practices, ones that may surprise you.